Okay, good morning, everybody. Welcome to Track E, Leadership in Action. I'm Bob Audette, partner lead of the data management practice at Guidehouse. I have distinct pleasure of kicking off today's session, which is really about best practices in operationalizing data stewardship in a federated model. I think it's a fantastic topic, honestly, given a lot of the sessions that have occurred over the past few days. Few logistical housekeeping things. The session is going to be recorded. The proceeds from the actual video will be, within 3 months' time, will be available on the CDOIQ YouTube channel. In addition, for questions for folks in the room, I will walk around, hand you the mic. Please introduce yourself, where you're coming from, and pose your question. We will also, for those attending virtually, if you could please use the Wahuva app to pose your question, and we will try to get to as many questions as we can in the allotted time. So with that, I really have a fantastic pleasure of introducing Dr. Christina Sandema Sombe, Chief Data Steward leader at Nike. She's a graduate of the Carnegie Mellon Chief Data Officer Program, numerous years as a data practitioner across a range of different data disciplines. I think you're in for a treat. So with that, I will pass it to you.
Awesome. Yeah, so thank you for the introduction. As stated, I've been doing data stewardship work for probably over the past 15 years of my career in different contexts, different industries. Started my career in nonprofit, and since then I've worked in management consulting, as well as retail, and now I'm also a budding entrepreneur with my own company with Data Cafe, serving clients with advisory services. I have my doctorate in information systems management, and I am Chief Data Officer certified, but I'm also pro-site change management certified, because that's very key when working with people and process. Oh, let's go back one slide. All right, so I'm going to start the presentation just to make sure that we're all operating from the same mental model, because there are very big lingo words in the title of the presentation. And so I'm going to start by first making sure that we understand what I mean when I'm talking about data governance operating models. I took a chance and actually run this through ChatGPT to see how is the industry evolving and thinking about operating models, and this is what it came back with. And I'm specifically focused on the federated data governance operating model. That's because that's where my experience has been. And every company that I've worked in has been global, and highly matrixed, and the federated model has been the most successful implementation in those contexts. And so I'm going to be speaking about that. For those that don't know what it really is about having central oversight from a central team, but execution occurring in a decentralized fashion. So business areas taking responsibility for their data and managing that. The second concept, just kind of digging in, is just trying to make sure that when we're looking at the federated data governance model, we know what that looks like, right? So that central team at the center, in implementations that I've participated in or led, is responsible for, building consistent literacy across the company, consistent maturity assessment, methods across the company. They're also, in a couple of teams that I've worked in, been responsible for the tooling centrally, just to try to make that more cost efficient for companies, rather than having everyone buy their own budget and create their own catalog and create their own data quality instance and so on and so forth. So as a cost efficiency measure, central team owning that has also been really good. And it also helps with standardizing the methods around procedures and how you work with those tools. In addition to that, collaboration with the stewardship. And so the central team doesn't operate in silo. They really are a connector. Really want to understand what's happening and be very collaborative to really understand organizational nuance too, in terms of how you're creating policies and standards, right? And so making sure that we're not talking from an ivory tower and downloading from Google what we would love it to be, but it's actually really contextualized for the reality and nuance of our company. And so them acting as SMEs and people that can give input into both how the organization works and the culture of the organization that can inform having better enforceable policies and standards has been very critical. In addition to that, in roles that I've been in, working through documenting accountability. So I know data ownership is a very messy subject, and I've worked in a couple of teams where I've been very fortunate to be able to really untangle and wrangle that mess, where it's very, very clear. And I'll talk about that a little bit as we go into the presentation. In addition to that, maintaining the reporting, and so really bringing our data management practices and up-leveling it to our executives and making sure that there's reporting around it. Depending on the kind of company you work in, if there is support even like through your board level, like thinking about how do you report about what's happening in the environment and how are your policies and standards being adopted in the company across the different areas. And then finally, to that pro-site change management certification, really helping business leaders drive change in their organizations because the execution is happening in their organizations. And so, central team can only have influence over the organization, but the business leader that owns the function or the area really has a big voice in what happens, what gets prioritized, and how people think about what's important. And so leveraging that executive in the change management process and really supporting them and enabling them and helping them think through the strategies that they can leverage to help be an evangelist for their own business area. In the spokes, that's really where the business lives, and they are the ones that own the stewardship and the execution in the federated model. And so, key things that they're accountable for is, the prioritization of what's important. What do they go after first, second, third? That's really tied very significantly to business value, right? And how they perceive what's valuable to them. In addition to that, performance of all the stewardship activities, and I'll make sure that we go through the concept level set and elaborate a little bit more about what those stewardship activities are. Staffing for stewardship, so who do we have within our organization that should be part of stewardship, and so that's the discovery side of it. And in many companies now they're hiring where they don't have maybe capacity within their existing employee base to kind of take on the stewardship activities, maybe because of the scope of the work and the size of the work that business area owns, and so they're trying to bring in those people. Or sometimes it's just a faster way for literacy to hire someone intentionally that already has the skills around stewardship and embed them in the business, and then they drive supporting and coordinating those stewardship activities for that business area. And then the last is collaborating both with the central team as well as with other stewardship bodies, especially for cross-functional type of data initiatives. So moving forward, the last concept that I want to make sure that we're level set on is like what's the value of data stewardship and what is it that they actually do? Well, they are absolutely responsible for the integrity, the quality, and really deriving the value out of the organizational asset. And they do this by adhering to the policies and standards that your organization has. That's where we see enforcement occurring. They are the advocates for this. So they are the ones that are evangelizing in their business, and they're the ones that are getting the stories that are most meaningful to the organization about what needs to be solved in order to make us better, faster, more profitable, and then really bringing that to life in the stewardship of the data. They're responsible for collaboration and communication between themselves, with their organization, and with other stewardship bodies that are established across your organization. And then in the weeds of what's the actual activities that they do, they are the people responsible for metadata management, data access and security, data quality management, data issue resolution, as well as the lifecycle management of data. So without further ado, I will now actually walk into I hope the better part of the presentation, which is really talking about 4 strategies that I've seen, used, we'll have examples to helped bring to life that have been successful in activating stewardship across the company, across multiple domains at the same time. We will start with the first one, which is sponsorship. So I know that very often we think about sponsorship, especially as CDOs, in terms of our sponsor and who is behind the office of the CDO. And are they championing and ensuring that the CDO office is able to perform their job? But in a federated model, in addition to that sponsor, you want to make sure that you have sponsors in every business area. This is really important because that truly is the evangelist in the federated model to really drive that change and ensure that their people are prioritizing the work. And so I think this is a very common pyramid, and I learned yesterday that people hate pyramids, but I know that this is this is a common pyramid that, like, if you do a quick Google search, it'll come up and it'll tell you, like, this is how you're supposed to structure those, your governance or decision rights within your organization and accountability. And at the highest level, you should have an enterprise data council. Then you should have a data leader or a trustee that's kind of sitting at that business ownership level, and they work together with technical and business people at the lowest level of the pyramid, operationalizing like the actual execution of the activities. What the literature often doesn't tell you is, well, who are the people that you should identify in your organization that actually do these things? And so one of the things that's really, really important, I think, is to ensure that you have an executive sponsor at the business area level. That is your enterprise data council leader. Very often in organizations, stewardship is developing organically. And so it's kind of starting at the middle. Someone decides that, well, this is a problem. I think I'm the data owner because I understand the problem. And then they start to corral other people around the problem, and they try to solve the problem from the middle. And sometimes that's very, very, effective. It usually helps with like getting that buy-in. But when you're thinking about scale, standardization, and making sure that there is a common expectation around stewardship in an organization, really having that top-down, buy-in from a sponsor that's actually like, focused on the strategy for the organization, what's important, and they're also elevating the role of those stewards so that it's opening doors. I can give examples of, stewards that thought they were stewards and wanted to participate in stewardship, but manager wasn't bought in, right? And so at that middle level, it becomes very, very difficult to activate into the role because you're either doing it as a favor because you feel it's the right thing to do versus as a mandate that's coming from the top. So that executive sponsorship is really, really important in driving change. One of the things is I would also say that that next level where you have the data owner should also be an appointed role versus someone that is discovered. And so just giving you an example from my experience, one of the things we did is that once we identified all of the business leaders at the VP level that should be part of the council, we said, hey, we really need to know who is your top data leader in your organization, the person that you trust, the person that knows your organization's data. So they gave us a person and said, well, go talk to this person. And what we did was once we had the 30 people across all of the different business areas, we sent them a survey and asked them, well, what data are you accountable for? And the results were really very interesting because this is where we now started to see that there's a lot of overlapping understanding around accountability. There's a lot of taking accountability for areas that people don't own, but because it's important to how that business area runs, they're kind of stepping into stewardship. And so what we did was we took those results back to the Enterprise Data Council members and showed them what their people were saying about how they think about it, how fragmented and how much of our data wasn't accounted for. And using the Enterprise Data Council member and facilitating conversations between them, they actually started to agree and negotiate the boundaries of data accountability. And so that's just a really, really powerful example of how when your executives are really bought in, it starts to help with really cleaning up the framework within the organization about who owns what. And it also makes it very, very, very much simpler for the organization to decide, well, now that we know who owns what domains should be activated that support our organization's strategy. So leading to that, very often, like I said, we try to sell, the executive buy-in through, a lot of the spiel around like offensive advantage or competitive advantage to the organization or defensive readiness. But I think that like in order for any of this to make sense and be valuable to the executives, again, thinking about that executive buy-in, it's really important that it's coming from them. They understand like which data is affecting what and how does it line up to the organizational strategy. And so there shouldn't be a separate strategy that's being led, because I think that's where you get into the danger of, well, we're not really seeing the ROI of this governance thing because it's just compliance stuff that they keep doing, and they keep doing this and that and the other. But if at the organizational level, let's say the business model, has adjusted to start, selling to an individual, well, now at an organizational level, as part of the strategy, they're going to say, let's make sure that we are handling consumer data, the right way. And that will also apply within how we think about, okay, now we have to make sure that all of our data is GDPR compliant, CCPA compliant, and so on and so forth. And so rather driving it from the top down than trying to communicate from your perspective as a governance person that these are the right things that we should be doing actually helps. And it starts to build a culture of risk acceptance as well, because there are so many problems to solve inside the organization. And so once you start to work through that consensus, working with the leaders, helping them understand these are the domains. If you don't staff for it and you don't have people assigned to it, do we risk accept as an organization that we're not taking care of this problem and we're focusing on something else, right? Moving on to the second strategy, which is around accountability. This is an actual real example of, kind of that results from the survey where, what are you accountable for? And then different departments shouted, I own it. And I'm using contract data as an example. In this example, you can see that the HR department believed that they had, accountability because of contracting workers and, certain types of contracts that they own and manage. The legal department believed that they owned and managed, the accountability for contract data. And so did the procurement because of the vendor type of, contracts. Getting into a room with the Enterprise Data Council members of the three areas and saying, hey, your people are unclear about who has accountability for this and who's really, someone that is dependent on, this being done. And so how do we work that out? And so we went through a process of, which department does it make sense? Central team really never has an opinion. We just want, who is the person we go to as accountable for this data when there is an issue. And they came to the conclusion that really all contracts should be owned by the Office of the General Counsel. But the stewardship body, nothing stops you from including people from the procurement and the HR organization in the stewardship of that data. And so having that very, very clear, data accountability, managed, through those conversations and then documenting it. And so in two companies that I've worked in, they've done an amazing job of documenting those agreements in profile systems, which is, a really amazing, if you think about, how we search for each other on LinkedIn or your internal directory, really being able to find okay, for this data, who is the person, who is the teams, what else can we learn about them? Where can we see the charter? How do we, learn where the stewards are? And really making that profile system very robust about your expertise. In addition to being able to find people, and this especially matters with cross-functional work, because very often that's what happens is, we know we need this data, but we don't know who else owns it, right? So having that profile system where you're actively documenting and saying this is how it's owned all the way up through the VP level, not only helps with the discovery, but it also helps with automation, right? So now you can build into your catalog some of that logic around issue escalation and remediation up and down the chain of command for that data. Another area that helps with scaling the expectations of stewardship is really about putting it in the expectation of job roles. And I've seen this done in 3 different ways. The first is through internal appointments. So to the first example where I said, that middle layer in the governance structure being appointed, treated like how you would announce a VP or a promotion in your organization, if you're saying this is the person who's been appointed with oversight, that is a very powerful message to your organization about who actually has decision rights over the data and who to go work with. And so really starting with like that culture from the top down, helping with that through newsletters, through all hands, leveraging those opportunities to bring that data leader to the front, to present, talk about progress in the organization, priorities and things like that, really starts to help establish that culture where that data is important and that there are specific people that have decision rights over it that you must work with, whether whether you want to or not, whether you would like to be able to do it your way. You still have to work with that person. The second area is really around like external hiring and recruitment. And so very often, you look at, for example, like analytics roles. Stewardship is not embedded as part of the job expectations, but it should be. You think about your engineering roles, your data product owner roles, like stewardship should be embedded in the job description. So the central team really has a partnership with HR in terms of like, how do we make sure that this is communicated, consistently in how we do, recruitment and how we update job descriptions for existing employees to reflect that this is such an important and critical area for the organization. It should be included in the interview process because we know literacy is hard. And, very often, most organizations are starting with people that have no experience with governance at all. So the central team has a really, much bigger effort in trying to upskill the organization to be able to take responsibility for their data. And, if you are hiring with that expectation that, you have done stewardship before in certain types of roles that typically end up being stewards in your organization, that actually starts to have the problem significantly. The last area is around individual performance management. This can't be important even to the individual unless their performance is actually measured against it. That affects remuneration, right? How they get paid. And if they're doing very, very well with stewardship, right, they should see raises, promotions, and things like that that are supportive of their career in the same way that you would give any other objectives to an employee. And so ensuring that like the goal development processes, the performance expectations, what you're having in your one-on-ones with people who have the role of stewardship, that's actually like part of the conversation and expectation. And especially as you're building up your literacy capability, the training, being required and expecting them to continue to upskill and ensure that they're aware and understand the policies of the organization and are able to execute that job well becomes really important. The third strategy is really around literacy. And I think that this one has been an interesting one because, where do you start from? There is just so much in data. There are so many topics. There is, fundamental 101 type things like what is data that like the general employee needs to know, and how do you build for all of that quickly and accelerate in your organization? It would take years and years and years. And so one of the things that has been extremely successful for me is building with intentionality. We're focusing on governance. Let's use our governance people to help, figure out like what are the topics that actually enable the steward to be able to execute their responsibilities. Can we start by creating a policy around that that provides the guardrails, the rules of the road, shall we say, for the organization? Because this matters when you're activating stewardship in many places. Everyone should have a very common mental model around like what is expected of them to be able to show that they're doing their job and delivering value. The next step of that is, how do we create standards that support that policy? So what do I need to do to demonstrate that I'm following the rules? Really being explicit. If we were saying that at a policy level, you should have stewardship body documented and expressed in our profile system, what do I do to demonstrate it? Well, for you to demonstrate that you've done this, you should have a charter, you should have the expertise or profile system completed, you should be publishing the minutes of your meetings, It should be, very easy to find, like how often that you're meeting and so on and so forth. And this is how you tell them that this is how you express that you are following the policy. Below that, you want to have conceptual training, because very often people that are doing the role are not governance professionals, right? So they're starting from zero. They really don't have a context of it. And unlike, many subjects like, privacy and security that we constantly see in the news, because you've maybe received a message yourself that you were part of, your information was part of a breach. So now you understand security, at least at that like basic level. Governance is a little bit more ambiguous for most people. They don't really understand like what does that mean in terms of like what are we doing to our data? What does it look like? And so really being able to have that, why are we doing this? Why is it important? What does it look like? That conceptual level, so that they can have an idea of what it should look like. And then, bumping that with the procedural training that actually helps them to execute the role. So, okay, you're saying that like part of the stewardship role is for me to catalog data. Well, then how do I do that? What system do you want me to use to do that? How do I know that I've written a good definition? Like help me help you so that I can express these things correctly. And then, I'm from a knowledge management background. That's how I started my career. Reuse, reuse, reuse. There is no need for every stewardship body to be thinking or spending time developing a format for an agenda. There is no reason they should have to, create the template for a charter. Provide these things as tools that are reusable, that can be used at scale, and that way you know what you're looking at, and you can actually do a very fair assessment of which stewardship groups are doing it well. Like, do they have a well-documented charter? Does it have all the things that we want to be in them to show that there is like true agreement on the ways of working for this group? It becomes something that is much, much easier to audit and decide where you need to support a team as a central team. On the left side there, that's just an example of like some of the types of standards that have been written to put those controls around like what do stewards do. The next one, and I've heard this one actually in a couple of presentations while I've been here, is about the community of practice. If we think about our MIT CDOIQ as a community of practice, y'all are coming here and you're learning and sharing best practices with each other. That people can take back and figure out how to do that. Because in your job as a CDO, you're pretty much like an island of stewards that is sitting by itself trying to kind of do the best with what they're seeing in the environment. And that learning curve is very, very slow. It's very much based on, let's make a mistake and learn from it and then try to improve. And it's very slow to getting to a place where you have a mature operating stewardship. And so communities of practice are a really, really good way to really federate the knowledge from multiple stewardships, and to help with, driving maturity of the organization at a faster rate. Because you'll have stewardships that are more advanced, that have done things, that have better understanding of the organizational culture and how to navigate it, because they made the mistakes first, and now they're able to be in this forum that's facilitated by the central team that brings all of them together. In roles that I've been in, that middle layer, where you have the data owners and the data trustees, is really who we target in bringing this community together. That doesn't mean that the people that work as stewards or custodians of data shouldn't be part of the community, but at minimum, you want the person that is ultimately accountable as the data owner to understand, to be able to learn from others, to figure out like how do they facilitate and run their stewardship effectively from others, for them to know who their peers are that they can go to have conversations. And it also has the added benefit in that, the more that you build that community, things like cross-functional projects, that ends up being very, very easy to coordinate, because now they know each other. And they've now learned that discipline of like, okay, let's figure out how we're going to document our ways of working and activate the stewards and custodians from each of our areas to kind of support the delivery of this initiative or project. So the benefits of communities of practice really start with that knowledge sharing, but it also helps with collaboration. It's a really good way to support professional development, and so you'll have, like I said, a lot of people starting from the ground where they'd never done this before. Suddenly you're introducing them to someone that is, level 3 on the DMM and has been doing this for a while that can partner and actually help upskill them a lot faster, promoting that learning culture within the organization. And it will foster innovation just because, you're not kind of working ad hoc as the wind changes around like what people think is important. Really the activation is happening at that data leader level around what's important, and they are working with the teams that they need to help. I've seen examples of teams even sharing collateral of assets that they've developed that help ease the way that, first of all, they'll share with the team that says, hey, we're struggling with this, and maybe we learn about it as a central team within the community of practice. But then we take that collateral and then make it enterprise reusable, right? So that everybody can use it. All of this, when you think about like the development of those artifacts around policies and standards and conceptual training and so on, in addition to the community of practice where you'll have things like video recordings and minutes, all of that is knowledge in the organization that can actually be moved and curated around those topics, around those things to help bolster people's understanding of how to enforce policy successfully. And I would say make that centrally available. Like have a repository, use SharePoint. Like I love SharePoint because I came from content management, but there's probably other content management systems that are just as effective where you can host this kind of things and share all of that knowledge. You can also curate from external sources and bring that in and build into your training. Like there's so much on YouTube. There's so much in Coursera and so on. If you have licenses for your organization, be able to take in some of those artifacts that can actually help you very quickly scale your literacy program, in addition to those things that help people with the organizational context. And so that's kind of the cycle of how knowledge sharing works and is repeatable, with the goal to make sure that not only is there a body of knowledge that's reusable, right? Because people change roles, people leave the organization, you have to restaff. You're not always starting from scratch. You can have those curated pathways that help people get up to speed very, very quickly, and know what it is that they're expected to do within the context of your organization. And it's all self-service, right? So this also reduces the burden on the central team, and enables people to really be able to run on their own. Last strategy is around engagement. This is not to say it's the only strategy. There are others, but I was limited by time. So I will go through strategy 4 and then close the topic. So gamification, and I think I mentioned right at the beginning around like reporting. It's a really, really good way to use reporting about how people are progressing in their journey with your enterprise data council. Because they didn't become leaders by chance. They're competitive. I am yet to be in any organization where your executives are not competitive and they see a chart that shows they're not green or shows that another business is ahead of them in some way. That suddenly puts fire under them, right? One of the things that a central team can do is help executives ask the right questions as well, like, because a lot of the time our executives also need to have their literacy built. So they see a chart like this, well, what can I do? Well, ask your people, do you know where all your data is? Have you cataloged all your databases and schemas and so on and so forth? Like we feed them those questions that help them really show and demonstrate to the people that are doing this work that it's extremely important. And being able to publish those leaderboards. I found that don't only do it in a meeting, circulate it in a newsletter for the organization so that people see how everybody's doing, and reward even your executive level, with incentives. And when I say incentives, it's things like, get them basketball tickets for being number 1 on the leaderboard, and and talk about it in the newsletter and say, hey, Jane Doe, VP of HR, just got basketball tickets to X game, because their area is really doing this and that and the other. That external recognition, people love it. It's similar to strategies around things like badging. People like people to see what they have accomplished. And so you really want to leverage that as you're thinking about gamification. This is just for illustration. It's very much aligned to kind of some of the policies and standards that I had expressed on the prior slide. And so you can kind of look at the columns and then look at areas where I set a standards, because that's actually where you're thinking about enforcement and reporting. And then incentivize stewardship. So, really from your data owners down, find ways to reward and recognize them. Because that's one of the things that helps with elevation of the role, and elevation that like people are recognizing that what they're doing is good work, it's hard work, it's important work for the organization. Some of the methods that I've used, include things like swag from the company that, especially you make a product that people love, like give them that product, they love that. Money or gift cards, that have money. Nobody says no to money. But one of the most effective ones, which has actually been interesting to me, is when you send an email and copy the steward or the data owner and their manager and the VP or senior leader that is part of the Enterprise Data Council. And you say, this steward is really like living the dream. That is something that like they cherish so much that like, oh my God, my senior leader is aware and this is what I did. And talk about it like with detail and say like, this is what we saw them do. And this is really, demonstrating that they care for our organization's data. And that's been extremely effective. In the same way that we give awards for tenure, we should give certificates of appreciation for stewardship and things that are, especially that are big wins for our organization. We should try to appreciate people those way. I already gave the example of tickets. I think tickets are something that is fantastic to everyone. I've done both from tickets to something fun to do, but even to development opportunities like the MIT CDOIQ. Like people appreciate being able to get some extra learning, just because they did something that not everybody gets. And then of course, kind of going back to the former point around, our HR processes, performance management, really being able to, at the end of the year, say that, you exceeded expectations as a steward, and that has an impact on how you get paid at the end of the year. That is also a form of rewards and recognition. All right, so with that, I'm going to conclude my presentation and just give 4 takeaways for those 4 strategies. The first being that, you really want to activate your executives to be part of the journey, because that's where change and cultural change happens. If they are part of the solution and they're helping evangelize within their area, that is more than 50% of your battle. The second one is really work to establish those clear lines of accountability, because it does create an environment for agility and scale, and intentionality as an organization about what should be activated and what shouldn't, in order to provide, to support organizational objectives. Around literacy, make sure that, as much as there is so much content, be intentional as well about how you build out your literacy programs. If what you're trying to do is standardize your practice of governance and make sure that at the bare minimum in your organization, people who are called stewards, or custodians or data owners know what it is that they're supposed to do to be effective, then build your literacy program to cater to that persona as much as you can first, so that you can start to make progress. And then finally, leverage engagement strategies, that are tailored to help with raising the profile of data in the organization. So being able to circulate newsletters, leaderboard information being made public and people being able to see that is really a way to raise that as a really important area for the company. That makes people more likely to want to really do well at it. Thank you.
Thank you for the awesome presentation. For the benefit of those that are virtual, there are a couple questions, and then we'll open up to folks in the room. I think this question was an interesting one, which is, how do you reconcile Nike's "Just Do It" motto with the balance between governance and innovation in the data function?
Well, I don't reconcile it. I don't reconcile it. I mean, I think, working in a central team, one of the critical things, and it even speaks to like how I think about branding the program, is you can still use some of that to to drive the cultural change in the right direction. So an example, when I first started, I wrote a playbook around a governance process for a set of data and how it would be managed in perpetuity. Well, what I did was, for all of the compliancy type things, I said, just do it. And so really putting that just do it to the compliance really helped with reshifting the idea of like, just do it. So I think that there is ways, every organization has, things that they do that can drive the worst behaviors or drive the best behaviors. It's really about how do you reposition those things so that they have the positive effect that you're trying to drive.
Great, thank you. And there's one other one, and I think you may have touched upon this a little bit in your remarks, but where is this one? Yeah, so in your experience, what are the main difficulties in defining data owners and data stewards, which I think you touched upon a little bit, and what would be the recommendations to assign them in a data domain?
Yeah, I really believe in appointment, and the point is that, like, if you think about let's use an area like supply chain. Supply chain is really, really big. So it would be a little ludicrous to have like one person, accountable for every domain that is like within the supply chain. But I still think you need to have that one data leader that's accountable for the supply chain, because it then becomes their responsibility to identify and help stand up, and maybe that next layer of, okay, for each domain within the supply chain, here's the people that are working, and I'm overseeing that they're doing the right things. They're working with the central team to make sure that their organization is in compliance. And so I think that there's the benefit of, you have a point person to work with that simplifies, the ways of working. But it's also like that person that's appointed is trusted by the business leader. And so, being able to have them, in sort of in the center, being able to articulate where they're having challenges, where they need support, in combination with the central team being able to help advocate for, what they need to be successful, ends up being a very winning strategy.
Great. Well, there's a few more really good questions on Wahuva, but I'll first open it up to the room to see if anyone has questions. Here we go.
Hi, thanks. I'm Chet Hurwitz from Ventures ATL, and thanks for a great presentation.
Oh, thank you.
I'm wondering if you could get into a little bit of detail about a situation in which you deployed these strategies to overcome some significant resistance, difficult behavior. By the way, names not required to tell the story.
Interesting story. Early in, and I was very early in my in my career. The sponsor of our team, he just found the work that we did around taxonomy and reference data boring. And he was quite a comedian, so we attended an offsite all hands, and all the shiny areas he's really pumping it up. I mean, he was such a great MC. He was that guy. And then he would sprinkle in every time a negative comment about the taxonomy and reference data and the stewardship work that we were doing around there, because he was just like, this is just so boring. It's behind the walls and like, who cares about it kind of thing, right? So at a break during that all hands, I walk up to him and and he didn't know me. I was pretty junior at the time. And so I said, you're our sponsor. You should be the biggest evangelist for what we're doing. Our job is already extremely hard, and you've just made it like 10 times harder because our own organization is not sold on what we're doing. And I'm like, I think you have to do better. And he was surprised that I was like just very forefront about it. This I didn't appreciate as much, but he went up on stage after the break, and he's like, Christina Sandema Sombe came and spoke to me about this, and she's recommended that I change my tone and language around taxonomy and reference data. So I'm here to tell all of you, and this is during the Justin Timberlake days, he's like, she's going to bring sexy back to and I was like, well, I guess that's another way. Two things I learned was, one, the power of his voice, because it really was a game changer in like how that program ran and grew. And for the company. But the other thing is like be in charge of your own branding, right? So be very, very intentional, because I had to live with bringing sexy back until I left. I left the company.
Another question in the room? We'll go over here.
A great presentation. Brent Maher from Student Transportation Company. And I'm a fellow Carnegie Mellon certificate grad, so good to see that in your bio. Can you just contrast a little bit about, well, one, I didn't know people didn't like pyramids either, but can you just contrast a little bit in some sort of practical sense, kind of what is composed of a typical top of the pyramid in terms of roles, titles, et cetera,
Yeah.
and then that second tier at a high level, and then
Yeah.
what are the topics that are being dealt with at the top of the pyramid versus the second tier? So just give us a little bit of contextualization about what's going on in those
And
tiers.
I may actually go back to it just because I did kind of put a little bit of notes in there just so that you could see sort of the typical things of that level. So let me jump back to it. But your enterprise data council could be your C-suite depending on the size of company. Very often it's a little bit lower than that. You really follow like the leadership title of the business area as much as you can. So when you think about product, finance, supply chain, like who is the person that actually like owns that at a level that is senior. Because sometimes in some organizations, it depends on like how big they are. Some of those functions get rolled up together even further at another higher level. So you'll have like a C-suite that owns like 3 or 4 different business areas together. That I think is more of a steerco level around, and that's really, dependent on whether your company really feels like they need to have a steerco level of engagement at the C-level. I think it's important because I do think that a really big challenge in culture in organizations is that the job of data is left only to the CDO. Nobody else really understands, knows, cares, and so it is important to also wrap that C-level. But from a council perspective, I would say that truly the leader of the business area is really who you're targeting. And then below that, that data leader also has to be a pretty senior person. So, titling is very different across organizations. I've seen it be at like a senior director level. I've seen it be at a senior manager level in organizations like management consulting, where they have partner, and then the level below that is senior manager. But it's still a very senior person that is responsible for this. Because if you think about it, using that supply chain example, they may be like overall accountable, but they may still need to identify a layer below of like true data owner that is responsible for corralling the stewardship and coordinating that. If they're too junior in your organization, no way that they're going to unlock the person that's the level below them to do that work.
Very helpful.
Yeah.
We go back to the virtual participants for the next couple questions. Hold on a sec here. So firstly, excellent presentation, very useful, but the question is around the accountability agreements. And are they informal, or there's some kind of formal memo of sorts? Can you talk a little bit about those agreements?
Yeah, they should be formalized. And the way that usually that's been expressed is that in the system of record itself, documenting those profiles and saying, think of it as your LinkedIn bio. This is the person who is the data owner. This is the description of the domain that they own. Here is the list of stewards that, works with them that are, from the technical side, from the business side, and here's their roles and responsibilities. And by implementing it that way, you can actually design the workflow too, through those personas as they're doing the actual work of governing data. So I would say have it expressed in an official system of record, whatever that is. One of the companies that I worked for actually had it separate from the governance installation and had a very robust profile system for the entire company. But what they did was they distinguished as much as possible with badging, around certain types of expertise that were extremely critical. And so you would be able to use the search functionality to be able to sort and find those people and then find that information about them.
Next one from the virtual participants. How does this model of stewardship connect to the analytics and tech enabling the business?
Yeah. So, and it's an interesting one because to that survey, one of the interesting questions that we asked in terms of like what data are you accountable for was what's the scope of accountability? Like, do you only own it in the source? Do you own it at the analytics level as well? Do you own it for just this location in the US, or do you own it globally? And what that did was it actually helped us understand gaps, gaps in coverage, but it also helped the central team come up with the point of view about what ownership should look like consistently across the company. And so, you know, using almost like a majority vote, wherever people saw themselves as responsible for the source and the analytics, we said, actually, we're going to write a point of view as if you are the data owner, you are responsible through every material hop that this data goes through in its life. Doesn't matter whether it's in analytics, doesn't matter if it's in the source, that owner is the owner. And what that means, it actually allowed us to put in controls around sharing, because now you think about those material hops as points of sharing data, right? And so now before it gets grabbed and someone just creates a dashboard or some data product or whatever, they're having to go back to the source system, data leader, negotiate the contract with them formally to say, this is the data that I want, this is the data that we're going to use, this is how long we're going to use it, here's who's going to have access to it, and really documenting all of those things and making it available in the system of record as part of the information about that, for example, data product or whatever. And then making sure that, like, one, it now gives us a way to audit life cycle-wise and things like that. Like, oh, okay, this product shouldn't last more than 5 years. After that, we should be talking about decommissioning it, or helping with rules of access and so on and so forth, and making sure that those things are registered. What it does help is it makes sure that you're not having a proliferation downstream of people just grabbing and then now, what's authoritative, whatever, like what should we be using? But it also ensures that, like, if we're going to use it now at the source, they understand that that's important to, that next thing that's using it. How do they make sure that that data that's flowing into it is well governed so that you can actually have like trustworthy stuff downstream?
Thank you. Any other questions in the room? There we go. We have probably room for maybe 3 or so questions.
Hi, I really enjoyed your presentation. Barbara Forth, I'm with William and Mary University in Virginia. My question is around testing the culture versus establishing the processes. Mm-hmm. So I've spent a year, I have a data governance council. It was assigned through the CIO, very senior individuals on it. Typically I go and they stare at me. And so there's been a great deal going through the process of just education, like this is master data, this is the problem, So part of it is bringing them online. I'm just to the point of introducing these pieces, but there's this tension between what is it that they will intentionally actually do, and what is it that we actually need to have put into place. And it's this kind of interest, and I like the scoreboard of what you had. So I've started with literacy, and some of the other very actionable areas, but I need to establish it. And so it's almost like you can't put some of these pieces in place unless they understand what it is and what the structure.
Yeah.
So what are your thoughts about that?
So one of the things that I would definitely say is, like, don't leave it to the council, right? Because at the council, really that should be like decision-making forum. You do need to do quite a bit of education and handholding prior to your council meeting. So, if you're introducing a new topic that's going to need decision, spend the time getting on the calendars of each of the members of your council to really make sure that they understand, what their stake or skin in it is. Because to the point, very often, only the CDO is expected to understand that, and it's almost like, let's push the problem, like they'll figure it out. But it just doesn't work that way. Like, it does require the input, and and I think that, like, the introduction of language around things like risk acceptance becomes really important, because very often, if I don't know something, or I meet a leader that, like, they're not comfortable with the subject, right? If you tell them that, part of this is that you're going to have to risk accept if you decide we shouldn't do it, suddenly they do have to understand it because they're not going to risk accept on something unknowingly, right? And so I think that really does help. And, in governance programs that I've worked in, really trying to align, critical data with risk taxonomy and making sure that common language is resonating so that it's really easy to be able to talk about those things, to say that, hey, this is in the critical data layer. If it's not addressed, it's going to be mapped and even serviced through our risk processes as something that's high risk for our organization also helps with some of that.
There you go.
Hi, good morning. Again, wonderful presentation.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you very much. My name is Steve Kennedy. I work at ResMed. One of the challenges that we face trying to build this model here is that we operate on a global scale. And so getting the right people in the room at the right time zone, everyone kind of communicating in that way is quite difficult, right? So synchronous versus async communication. How do you build this program on a global scale?
Well, I think that a lot of the, especially like on the literacy strategy, really moving towards a lot of self-service, right? And so whether it's, recordings from your community of practice so that people are able to see kind of what's being discussed and stay on the same page and have access to minutes and, being able to like access that real-time live information and knowledge creation that's happening, in real time, in addition to being able to self-service materials that help them really understand, step by step from a conceptual level all the way down to procedures, like does help a lot of that. Some of it you're also just going to have to try to work around the time zone. So, especially with some of the training type things, offering to host sessions, in the time zone for certain things and putting those on a cadence that enables people in those time zones to join and learn, especially from the central team, can be really, really important. Definitely in a stewardship, situation where it's like the stewards are across geographies, that can be definitely more challenging to manage. But what I have seen is sometimes what the data owner will do is that they'll also they'll appoint someone that kind of works on that half and make sure that they're aligned with that person all the time so that their messaging in the geography is the same way. And then that way, it's a much smaller meeting to have to convene, right? Much fewer people, because now you're working with individuals. You have 3-4 geographies. It's 3-4 people that you're like, okay, we'll have a cadence every 2 weeks, every month. We'll meet for 30 minutes to make sure we're aligned on how this is going, and then kind of keep things moving that way.
Thank you. We have time for a really quick question, and then we'll need to wrap up.
Okay.
I appreciated our conversation on Tuesday. Christina, thanks for the presentation. I was just wondering your thoughts on computational governance, like sort of taking all the things that you have on paper in terms of your standards and making sure it's machine readable, and what you're doing in your program for that.
Well, I haven't. I think that's a little bit newer space, to be honest. One of the things that I will say is that, like, at least in the catalog, what we try to do is express those policies as part of the tagging of the data elements. So if it's something that's subject to GDPR, you have the tagging for that, and you also have the relationship to, like, the information about the policy, so that people are able to say, okay, it's tagged for this thing, don't know what it is, let me look at it. And then that way they're able to kind of still derive the same outcome.
Thank you very much. Super insightful. Thank you, everybody. Have a wonderful day.